Good morning. How's everybody? Hopefully, thank you for turning up. We do appreciate that as a panel. And I have, the great job of being the moderator this morning on a topic that's quite passionate to me personally around the role of government in driving policy and investment for, I'm calling it food and ag systems, or the future of food in a way. And it's great to be joined by a fabulous panel. Before we start, I'd like to just understand how many people in the audience are from government. Right, great. So we look forward to hearing your questions and I'm sure your feedback and inputs, because to set the context, while we do have one person from the EU representing government, the rest of us are not. And we have over a career obviously worked very closely with government, been on the receiving end of many grants and on advisory boards and on task force, and we're, bringing an external perspective to this. So before I kick in, just to introduce very quickly, and each of my panel members will introduce themselves. We're sitting directly under our photos, so you can see the great images and the real person as well. But Anna, Ian, DJ, Catherine, and Lionel there. I say that in good respect, of course. Oh, right. I don't know what's happened between Catherine and Ian over there, but we leave that. So let me set the scene on this, right? So I guess the topic, is really about, just to reinforce an external view of our interactions between government on policy and investment, and also key actors across the food value chain in terms of what's been our role, but our experience in how we've actually done that over many decades, but also different continents as well. And, we've got a great representation here to start to bring that global perspective as well, as opposed to really looking in from within the Australian. We're going to focus on opportunities, but also probably some of the challenges as we're hearing over the last few days. And I guess just personally from my perspective, given my experience having worked 20 years in industry, but also the last 6 years starting a investment that was largely led by a large corporate, which was Mondelez International in the Victorian state government, and starting a sector-led food innovation model in Australia, in Victoria. So I guess I've seen the impact of how you create a shared vision with a government that was willing to step in, with a corporate that was willing to step in, but how we brought all of those actors across the food value chain together. And I think as we look at some of the big challenges that we're all facing into, I think, you'd be sitting under a rock if we didn't know that. And the fact that you guys are here committed to hearing all of this and being part of the dialogue. But one of the things that I constantly, probably what keeps me awake is how do we do more with less, but how do we also collaborate in a much better way? And if you think about the big shifts that are coming through in terms of technology, whether that's ag tech, food tech, AI, just to name a few, sometimes a lot of these policies tend to lag behind. And I guess I'd rather, as we start to set the scene, what is the role of government, but not just the government, but what is the role of every actor in that food value chain in terms of how do we work together, collaborate together around new policy development, and how do we even get on the front foot rather than always lagging behind on that? So that's the scene I'm setting for my panel. And let me pass it off to Anna, who is driving RMAC's, industry-wide challenge. And she's got a pretty big challenge, which I really love, is around achieving a $7 billion goal on growth by 2030. So Anna, are you able to share a few insights from your experience?
Yes, thank you. And hopefully I'm looking true to form to my profile picture, because that is in no way staged. Thanks, Angeline. And we were lucky enough to meet each other when you were running the Food Innovation Centre. But just for the people in the room, we actually are a policy leadership forum that represents beef, sheep meat and goat meat from paddock to plate. So we've got everyone from the farmer, the lot feeder, the manufacturer, the livestock exporter, the retailer, all in our very, very broad church. So when we think about innovation, it's innovation that's looking at the customer and that rewards everyone back in the supply chain. So at the end of the day, this is a conference about the global table, and farmers don't just make food and manufacturers don't just make food. We make food as a food chain. And when it comes to government policy settings, that really needs to be reflected. We've got to work together and collaborate with each other within the supply chain as customers to each other. And with that, that will drive genuine innovation outcomes. One of the probably flagship programs in the red meat industry that we've led, and I'll talk a little bit about how the government enabled that, is MSA, which was all about matching customer preferences with meat science. So we were able to deliver better qualities and better grades of meat to customers in the manner that they wanted and market it accordingly. That's opened up new markets for us and our processing arm. And I was talking to Jason Strong, who was the first ever meat grader in 1995. And he said last financial year, that MSA program actually made farmers, so producers, Farmgate, David's members, $198 million. So that is a great example of how we can combine the entire supply chain, our food innovators, our meat scientists, our marketers, and actually put more money back into red meat businesses' pockets, which is our job. So that is a flagship example of how good food innovation drives excellent outcomes that we all benefit from. You guys do when you enjoy your steak, and we benefit from it because we make more money. So with that in mind, I could talk about innovation in red meat forever. I could talk about how much I love eating red meat forever. But just probably a few passing comments on food policy in Australia. And it's very complex, and we've got a lot of investment, and we've got a lot of programs and policies, some of them prohibitive and some of them major enablers. So we're pretty privileged in this country. For every dollar we spend on research in agriculture, we actually receive $1 co-investment from the federal government. So that's an exceptional program, and we'd like to keep that, and that allows us to do a broad range of things that provides us with a major comparative advantage. We also have things like the FIAL, the industry-led, government-empowered Food Innovation Centre. We're great researchers, world-class. We've got CSIROs and some of the world's leading universities, but we're not very good at getting our researchers talking to our business community and bringing that together, that commercialisation and adoption project, not just in agriculture, in every sector in Australia's economy, is quite critical to getting our innovation settings right. And that's reflected in our global innovation rankings. We go up, we go down. Just another comment. Not all of it is about innovation policy. So I'm from Queensland, please forgive me, Victorians, but in Queensland, to produce one single piece of steak, whether you're eating it in Tokyo or you're eating it in Brisbane, it takes 300 acts of government regulation. That is an extraordinary amount. So when farmers and manufacturers are participating in all of that compliance, they're doing compliance and not necessarily doing applied innovation within their supply chain. So I think my final comment is we as an industry need to think more as a supply chain. We're 82,500 businesses. That's a lot. And we don't necessarily in every case have a supply chain relationship mentality, and we need to change that. But where government can in turn help with that is to put their food policy and innovation settings also focused on the supply chain. We've got VIAL sitting over there in Department of Innovation. We've got our rural and research corporations like MLA under the Department of Agriculture. We've got departments like, health and the Treasury, and they're all doing things in little bits and pieces everywhere, but they're not enabling us to think better as a supply chain. So I think that's all from now. I may never get this mic back, so thank you.
Thanks, Anna. That was really comprehensive. I might, if I'm not biased in any way around the females on the panel, sorry boys, but I'll jump to Catherine. Catherine, I've always admired your leadership and passion, certainly for South Australia, but for broader Australia as well, and what you've created with Food SA. Are you able to share some of your perspectives around the key opportunities and I guess the great work that you've been doing to maximise that collaboration that we spoke about earlier as well?
Well, it's an interesting comment that Anna just made, just jumping in on that about the silos that agencies at local, council, state and then federal government actually live in. And so what we find is industry is actually really quite good at collaborating, and it's a government mantra about collaboration, but governments actually are not very good at collaborating themselves. And I think that's one of the really key things. And currently our organisation is membership-based, but we have a very, very close relationship with the state government and have a 4-year funding deed with them to run programs to increase capability, markets and the connections. So that's a fantastic program, and we actually have licence to be able to develop that program on the basis of what industry is actually telling us they need, and that's really letting go from a government perspective. We have rigorous reporting around it all, but we actually write the script, so that's fantastic. Currently, actually, and interestingly, we're going through an industry-led process for a growth strategy. What's really interesting in that process is the bureaucracy writes the discussion paper from their own lens, and what happens is you've got the current government, and they come and go pretty quickly. Bureaucrats come and go less. Industry people have been around forever. If they own a business, they were there 20 years ago when some of this industry-led activity happened. So you have a lot of churn with people within the bureaucracy and also within government. So what's really hard then is there might be a government focus about this industry-led process, and the bureaucrats hear it, may or may not like it, then kind of get pushed a little bit to conform and then revert to type. And I think culture and the way government collaborates, and particularly within the bureaucracy, is really challenging. So having said all of that, my name's on that paper, so I'm going to make sure it is industry-led.
Good to hear. Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good start. So let's move across to the ditch to New Zealand, a country that we admire. For all those visiting Australia, we just call it across the ditch, and maybe you could be one of our states. We definitely love your PM anyway. Ian, can you, I guess, share with us what the clever Kiwis have been up to most recently, as I say. And in particular, when I spoke to you about the Te Hano movement and how you're bringing some of that shared vision and collaboration together.
Okay, thanks for inviting us to come across. And maybe our Prime Minister's more popular here than she is at home at the moment. So,
right.
But in terms of where we're at in New Zealand, we recognise, we're unique. We are the only developed country in the world that relies on what we can grow and sell to the world to pay for our schools, pay for our roads, pay for our hospitals. So there is undoubtedly an incredibly close connection between our primary sectors, how we grow food, and how we create our wealth, and how, therefore, our government functions. So we are going through a process. It's one of the many committees that our government has set up, but it's specifically a committee targeted, we call it the Primary Sector Council, and it's working to create a vision for New Zealand's food and fibre sectors to move forward. We recognise, and we have accepted that the world's climate is changing. We're in a situation where we need to respond to that climate change. We produce a lot of animal protein that is seen as part of the problem around climate change, so we need to actually position ourselves to be the world's most sustainable food producer. So the way the process is working, and it ties to the Te Hano movement, which is a movement entirely industry-led but entirely government-enabled. So we work very, very closely in partnership around what the future needs to look like for New Zealand. So in November, we will bring out a very bold vision for our country. MPI has been an integral part of bringing that process together. We work with Stanford University in a collective way to facilitate the process of moving towards that vision. I was lucky enough to spend time up at Stanford a couple of weeks ago, where we had 70 senior leaders in the room, including the chairman of most of our major organisations, as well as our minister, as well as our Director General and Head of Policy within the Ministry for Primary Industries, the CEO of our Department of Conservation, so bringing all of government and all of industry together to get a single collective view. And I suppose that ties to very much how we see the future. We don't see a supply chain anymore. We see a web, and we see a web where the consumer sits at the centre, and every participant that helps deliver food or the experience, whether it's food or a fibre experience, to a consumer, has the ability to connect to that consumer. The government is a critical part of that web. And the government therefore needs to understand what is important with the end consumer of the products and respond in how they set regulation. The comment you made about 300 regulations does not surprise me. But the trouble is that the government is struggling to keep up in making the new regulations to enable us to keep markets open. So we see government as an integral part of the web. We equally see the community as a critical part of that web as well. And therefore, because the community sets the license to operate, the government responds to the community's view around license to operate. So how it all comes together is how we're hopefully going to create a New Zealand food and fibre sector that's set up to, actually create an industry that will keep our kids in the country and New Zealanders fed long term.
Wow. There's a lot to learn from us from there as well. I'm sure everyone will agree. Let's jump to DJ. I guess you represent, the other side of the coin or along that web, if you will, our farmers. And I'm interested to hear if you can share some of their perspectives as, I guess, as relating back into policy and the changes and that regulatory burden that may come through in terms of what they're trying to do to drive innovation.
Yeah, so I've got the great honour of not only being a farmer and living and breathing what we're discussing today, but also representing a lot of Victorian producers that are also trying to make their way through either be it frameworks or sustainability to try to make sure their businesses are viable into the future. And one of the great challenges what we've seen is moving from a very regulated market from a generation ago to now a very deregulated market that has a lot more laws and a lot more restrictions that they have to comply to than what was previously straight up and down as far as they had a helping hand to navigate through that system. And what we're seeing is a lot of regulations that pop up that are very much a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator of where our industry needs to head. And that not only creates an issue around how should that be policed, how can we actually make sure that that's a beneficial consequence of trying to solve a problem versus where do we actually need to lead the industry? Where do we need to take that investment to? And I do echo those sentiments that we have got a very good R&D system federally that does give the opportunity to have a pot of money where we can apply for projects and as an industry help try to decipher our way through that. But that doesn't negate the fact that both all three tiers of government, local, state and federal, needs to actually have a place where they can see their future of assisting. Now that assisting isn't necessarily running our organisations, it's ensuring that we have the right tools or mechanisms around be it markets, be it access to markets, be it even access to some of the core inputs that we do have. And for example for that is the electronic ear tags that we've introduced in Victoria recently. It's a technology that's been around for a long time and a lot of producers were using that. But to utilise that as a whole of industry mechanism still has a lot of work to go. It's a great thing that we've now got a government that's got behind it, but there's a long way to go down that process to actually making it functional at the grower level. We also see that in other issues such as be it labour or, once again, access to markets. It's great that you've got a free trade agreement with a partner in country, but until we've got some of the other photosanitary issues under control, some of the other trade issues in general that we can not only promote our wares to the markets, but actually fully utilise those agreements, we'll always be a little step behind of where we actually need to push to ensure that not only can we keep up the economic viability of our businesses, because we are high production, high cost industry in Australia. We've got some of the world's best living standards, and that comes at a cost. And that cost is that we've got to make sure that our businesses can extract either a premium or we've got to reduce the amount of labour that's within our systems. And that has a consequence for communities, that dichotomy of trying to make sure that we are keep maintaining the higher level and the high value versus what it actually means for the people on the ground. And the last part, I guess, is when we do have the circumstance of people being able to have higher wages and having higher take-home is a concerning effort to understand where their food comes from and what that food actually means to them both ethically and morally, and how agriculture itself has a responsibility to address those issues as well.
Wow, sounds like some great stuff happening. If we can pass over to Lionel, and you'll probably travel the furthest, so thank you for joining us. But also, please share with us your perspective sitting in the EU and what you're sort of working on around market access and geographical expansion, but also I hear there's a Horizon 2020 program. I don't know much about it, so I'd love to hear a bit more from your perspective, but also to enlighten us on the bottom part of the earth, if you will, on some of the things that is happening that we can really learn from as well and adopt, I guess.
I will not. First, thank you, Angeline, and thank you for Global Table for inviting me today to participate to that panel. Indeed, I travel probably quite far away from the different colleagues. First, on the collaborations we have with Australia, and before patronizing, and instead of patronizing on what we can share or from our experience, I would like first to highlight that there's a very high degree of collaborations between the EU and Australia. Actually, EU is the first country with which Australia collaborates in research, and over the period of time between 2011 and 2015, more than 13,000 co-publications were issued between Australians and EU research institute. So it's EU is of course a very important collaborator for Australian researchers. At the same time, Australia is the fifth non-EU collaborator for EU research institutes. So it proves that there's already a very long established close collaboration and fruitful collaboration between EU and Australia. And that covers many areas, but also, of course, as a subject of today's panel, health and agriculture and food. We have running programs, very specific running programs, and you, David, you mentioned some SPS challenges, so very specific programs for either pest or animal diseases, but more extensively, we have also collaborations in global challenges. You have next or behind you, Angeline, these nice, colorful cubes, which highlight some of the global challenges we're working together to get solutions for, and that could be water management, and water management in Australia these days, and in particular in Victoria, is also, of course, a fundamental issue. And we have another areas of during which on which we are collaborating closely. And this is done under one of his policy you mentioned from the EU side, which is Horizon 2020. As you can imagine, it's going close to the end of its program. We're working on the EU on 7-year programs. So the current Horizon 2020 covers the collaborations and in research, in the international aspects too. So this is basically a program supporting with funding, supporting collaborations between EU and non-EU institutes for research. That will be continued with another programs, of course, basically taking the same pillars as Horizon 2020, but we try also to learn from the experience and that the experience coming from the feedback we got from research institutes. So maybe today, at the beginning of the panel, I didn't raise my hand as a government representative because I was not physically in the audience. I had the chance to be on the stage, but this is clearly from the government point of view, the feedback that we are looking for to improve the way we collaborate and the way we accompany the collaborations in the research. We have also other programs than Horizon 2020. From the EU point of view, we have also a specific programs covered by the Common Agricultural Policy of the EU. So that's mostly targeted towards our farmers, but that's also could feed into the debate today. we felt about 8 years ago that research in agriculture was important enough to be a bit more closely associated to the running of the more general agricultural policy. So the programmation is directly now under the umbrella of the service in charge of the agricultural policy in the EU. And the aim, of course, is still to further increase the investments in research and innovations, but the additional element is to ensure and to enable that the direct effect of the research contributes or benefits to the farmers and rural communities at large. So we felt that the putting these two aspects under the same umbrella was a benefit for the farmers community at large.
Fantastic. That's really great to hear. And I think in the audience you would agree probably a lot of commonality in what we've also hearing as well around some of the key themes around collaboration, the complexity of how we navigate some of our policies and the regulatory burden around that. But maybe one question as I look at the big red clock over there as well, and I'm going to throw it open to all of my panel here, is what do you know, if we sit here and we talk about food systems innovation, and we know innovation is such a buzzword and everybody is talking about it, thinks, whether we really figure out how we do it. But right on the heels is exactly disruption coming, right? So there's a lot of disruption that's coming. We're seeing it across the whole web or the food value chain if you look across. What's one advice, I guess, from the panel to the regulators on how do they really keep up in the world of disruption that's coming? That's about to hit us, or is already hitting in certain parts. Who wants to have a kick-off?
I'll go first.
Ian?
Well, I presented to MPI a couple of weeks ago when they launched a new strategy, and I said, you'll never keep up. And I believe that's probably the case, because I don't think anybody can keep up with the level of change that's coming. We've got $16.8 billion a year being directed into disruptive technology. To know what that's doing is incredibly difficult. What they can do is their best. And I think to do the best, it's about the regulator building relationships with industry that are much deeper, and having that ability to understand from industry what's coming out, but also making sure that they're not confining themselves, in our case, to Wellington, and getting out and building networks right around the world so that they're sharing information. And I, again, come back to is how close are they to the consumer, because the consumer will help to guide what regulation needs to look like as well.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good question, because you've got to have the same objective and you've got to get on the same train. And so if you actually, from a strategic point of view, work out what you want to do, and the government, industry, academia, then how do you do it? And you've got to all be flowing in the same direction, because if you're not, you get paralysed.
So, Catherine, I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to ask you, how do you do it? Because I think we hear this all the time. We talk about the three planets, as I call it, of government and industry and academia. But what are the tips? So what is something, someone's sitting there and someone tangible, like what can I go and do tomorrow? Where do I start? So, having shared vision takes, there's a journey that you go through. Let's hear from what Ian has said. But what's the one how, I guess?
Well, there's probably lots of answers to that, but I think it's actually industry that's going to grow this economy. We are all, as industry bodies and as government officials, we're merely facilitators. So the first step is to actually think that that's right. Governments don't make money. Industry does. So therefore, industry has to be the driver. So how do you communicate with industry to get what the top 3-4 issues are, and then government can facilitate that change to fix things? So, look, there's lots of different answers to that, but that's probably one of them. I think you've just got to keep thinking about what the common goal is, and if you're not engaged in the common goal, then you've got to go and do something else because you're too painful.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, panel?
I'll give it a crack, and I would actually turn it back on decision makers, and I'd say, how are you participating in disruption? What role is technology and emerging research playing in how you deliver a regulatory service? There is so much regulators can do that they're not doing when it comes to satellite imaging, citizen science, augmented reality that would allow them to be better, more real-time regulators that would reduce burdens on both government and industry. So I'd say, look, we've all got a role to play, and we've got to be responsive and agile and obviously embrace disruption and do our best out can. But there is enormous opportunity for regulators to also do that, and I would encourage them to do so.
TJ?
As a farmer, it's always interesting to hear that frameworks, sustainability, and all that. But at the end of the day, they're the ones who usually find the solution. And be it that I don't ever look to government for a solution because, to be quite honest, I don't have that much time. That's the reality. So what I do need government there is to make sure the goalposts are set and stick to it. So if there's going to be a piece of legislation that comes through that is that transforms an industry, yes, there needs to be strong consultation. But the amount of consultative reports or even recommendations that I do read on an annual basis, if only half of those were applied, then that would be a good result, because there's a lot of work that does go into those systems. And if you've got a good report, if you've got a good outcome, if you have a good common goal, getting everyone to commit to it for their parts is what I find very frustrating at the representative level. But down at the grower level, we don't really see that impact, or we don't really see the fruits of that until numerous years later. So we'll find a solution in between. So for me, I reckon data is one of the big things that is around the corner, be it that there's a lot of us that generate data. There's a lot of information that we can lock, be it modelling, be it understanding trends from that to get more to the leading side of things. But the issue around data is then what is it going to be used for if it goes to a regulatory response? And we've seen that with in Queensland, where data had to be deleted because the government wanted to use that as a new mechanism to control or to take action on people who are quite willingly giving that data, trying to make the industry better, but the regulators wanted to use that to enforce laws. So there is that fine line. For me, data is going to be the big thing that everyone needs to understand the value of it, needs to understand how they can use it to make sure that it's more seamless between industries and organisations. But more so, I believe, and I'm completely biased here, but I believe that the real strength is ensuring that when we have regulators, when we do have government, that you're empowering the producer to get on with their job, not to stand in their way. But if there is a gap or a challenge, that two-way communication, yes, it's an old adage, and we do need that. But once we've made that commitment to achieve that outcome, to make sure that we invest in it, at both industry and government, to achieve it.
Just a quick word coming back to your initial questions on disruptions and how to work around that. I mentioned that the successors of Horizon 2020, which is Horizon Europe, we don't set any time frame now, time limits. So the EU is here to stay. That's another message.
Good.
So what I wanted to say is that there are some innovations in also the research programs, and one of it is the European Innovation Council, and this is a one-stop shop to support and scale up the innovations of disruptive nature, which will be accessible to public bodies, but which are too risky for private investors. So this is clearly also one of the solutions that we have proposed. It applies, of course, to all research, and I will stop here because maybe disruption, after the buzzword innovation, maybe disruption is a good candidate to become also a buzzword.
Yeah, great. Very insightful. Thank you. So I'm conscious of our time. I'm probably going to ask one question, and I'm going to ask you guys to, given you have the stage and you have an engaged audience, what's the one, and I'm really looking for the how, right? So as a mix of industry, government, and academia, I'm sure out there, what's the one advice to anyone sitting there going, what do we need to do collectively and collaboratively, I guess, as we go forward in driving food innovation, food disruption, the solution of the future of food? I'm only asking for one.
work from the ground up would be my perspective on that, because you talk about growers, you talk about food manufacturers, food processors. They're the drivers of the economy. What are the 1, 2 or 3 things that will make the difference for them? Aggregate all of that rather than start at the top and have a discussion paper for everyone to feel warm and fuzzy about.
It's good, Catherine. I like that.
I'd almost concur. Like, I reckon grower groups is where the action's at from my side of the fence, because at the end of the day, it's going to come down to supply and demand. Agriculture is supply and demand. Love or hate it that you've got a provenance feel-good story, which is fantastic, but if the consumer doesn't desire your product, if the consumer doesn't see a need for it, we're going to always struggle. So I think that understanding what the drivers are of that at the grassroots level, to actually give that messaging back to say either A, there's an opportunity, or B, we have a competitive advantage, because sometimes I think in agriculture we confuse competitive advantage with trying to appease a populist view. We get the two mixed up, and then all of a sudden we forget what we were here in the first place for. So getting back to what we're good at, making sure that we do it well, and giving that support to not only find a placement for that product or get that feedback from the consumer to how to make sure that we are tailoring it.
From my perspective, and I've been entirely New Zealand-centric here, we need everybody on the same page. We need a complete commitment to the fact we're going to transform our agricultural system, and we're going to feed 5 million people properly before we export our first kilo of product. If we do those things right, we will create a huge amount of value that will benefit all New Zealanders.
Okay.
Yeah, then you will have the last word.
She likes the last word.
Well, for me, closer ties in all areas. Obviously, in Australia or in the EU, between government officials, research, farmings, and between the EU and Australia. We have, as you mentioned, we have ongoing negotiations for free trade agreements. We have agreements and established collaborations in research for a very long time. We have many agreements in many other areas than farming. And these agreements, these dialogues, they just ensure a better transparency, a better share of experience, and for better and meeting and addressing global challenges.
Anna, lucky last.
Well, thank you, Lionel. And just with the FTA, we're looking to enjoy some particularly favourable outcomes when it comes to red meat. So that's actually why I was holding on to the mic. Look, I think that my main message is that I really actually just want people to feel good about eating red meat, and for them to enjoy red meat around their table on Sundays and at election day and every other day in between, because at the end of the day, we want to... The food and wine and other experiences you have with friends and family, that's the things you remember at the end of your life. But with a specific focus on food innovation, I was thinking through this, and I came up with the 3 Fs. None of them are swear words, but we need freedom, we need finance, and we need federation to all work together to engineer those cross-supply chain outcomes. So we need deregulation, we need innovative policy settings, we need all the different arms and legs of all of our different federation investment and policy programs to come and work together, and Angeline's Innovation Centre is a great example of how that can happen. And we need some finance. We need to make money, and we need to receive government investment. So if I leave you with anything, it would be 3 Fs, no swear words.
Right, I like the 3 Fs. Will, how are we going?
We're going good. We've got about 20 minutes for questions, so thank you very much, panel,
Great.
for your insights, and I'm sure that's kind of really helped to jog a couple of questions. We've got actually quite a number of questions come through, so I'll start going through some of them, but again, if there are any that just raise your hands, introduce yourself, direct it to a speaker, and I'm sure they'll be very happy to field it. So let's go with question 1, if I may. Question here, how do we shift governments from being reactive to proactive? And how do we ensure we have a framework for fostering and attracting entrepreneurs and innovators? And this one could go to Lionel. As you try to pass off the mic.
Well, I was about to hand the mic to colleagues, because I think the question is addressed more to either farmings or research, because their experience in seeing how the government is really acting. So not only trying to elude the question, because I'm not so sure to have a right answer, but I think generally it's up to the farmings to farming sector to initiate and to stimulate, maybe based on the experience where there's a lack of reaction.
So we had a policy, our Ministry of Primary Industries, Protect and Grow. They've now refined that to bring in prosperity, sustainability, and previously the key focus was biosecurity and food safety. They're still important, but it's about a cultural change within the ministry to start getting people to think about the fact that they exist to actually fuel success. We capture $1 in $6 of what our products get at end user. The ministry can help us unlock that. That's $40 billion extra if we can do that in 10 years.
So I think one of the really important distinctions is there tends to be a tick box mentality. So if I've ticked all the boxes, then I've done my job. I think if there's a focus more on outcomes, what are you actually wanting to achieve? So don't just tick the boxes, because that's actually administrative. What's the outcome? What's the focus? And I think that's the really important bit, because that will then start to provide, and it is a cultural change. Bureaucrats live in fear of ministers, no doubt about it. There's a huge disconnect. So I think if you're in the bureaucracy, to actually respectfully push back and get your colleagues to be the same and not tick boxes, but think about what's going to make a difference, ultimately that will start to show through that there are some outcomes and results.
I'd just probably say listen to your trusted institutions like the CSIRO. I mean, they have done enormous work on plotting out the future of food and agribusiness in this country, and are an advisor to government and have, told government how they can make more money. So I think listen to these institutions we've created to actually enable that growth.
And personally, if government's actually the leading agency in this, I think we might have it around the wrong way. I think it's more of the partnership. There should be no one, hopefully, too far ahead of the other, because if government's leading the industry, as a producer, I'd feel like I've let the ball down and the innovation or the disruption that we talk about actually hasn't flowed through to the right spot, because a great piece of paper doesn't grow anything. So I would hope that that's more of a partnership in that sense. But coming back to the point of how can regulators be more involved, is to actually understand what the heck they're talking about. And I say that with the greatest respect, because I've met some really talented researchers that have told me in a mathematical equation what I knew intrinsically about my property, intrinsically about what I do. So for them to actually spend some time in our shoes, and then vice versa, producers understand what it takes to either create good policy or even go work through the academia or the research side of things, is something that I don't think we've done super well in the past. And I feel like that would be a big change for everybody within industry to commit to make it better.
Great, and I just want to, we've got a question over here, and I'm going to run have we got a spare mic that's going to run across there? No, that's okay. I just wanted to also mention Angeline is on the panel, not because she's just a moderator. She is full of and a wealth of knowledge, so make sure you ask Angeline some questions too.
Oh dear. I have mine.
Hi, Patrick Watson. Catherine, I think your comment on box ticking was spot on. The bureaucracy does tend to tick boxes, and we've done innovation. We'll move on to the next thing. And I won't mention examples, but we've seen that recently in Victoria. The question I had to ask was, when you look at the Australian percentage of GDP spent on R&D compared to the G20, we're bumping around the bottom. And I would assume that government does drive food innovation, and food innovation is driven through R&D. How can we fix that? How can we get more investment in R&D in Australia?
Here you go.
Is that to me, that question? Oh.
To the panel. Maybe I'll start. I think, I guess most recently my stint in a university, which was scary for 3 years, but the other side of that coin was 20 odd years in industry, right? So I think fundamentally what I've learned out of that is how do we actually, and it comes down to really the basics, how do we work collaboratively together? It has to be all of those stakeholders together to come to a commonality. And I know we talk about collaboration at large, but for me it's actually finding the win-win for all parties. And how do you get to that 1 + 1 = 3? Because if you look at all of the things that we need to solve collectively, globally, we are not going to do it by ourselves. We have to have others in there. And therefore that means that we are going to have to share, and we're going to have to build trust and confidence in those partners to be able to take us to the next level. So if anything, I think, that's experience from the last 6 years with the Food Innovation Centre and what we've been able to achieve, but it's only been able to be achieved because we've had the right partners come together, the people who do want to share in your vision and create that shared vision together to actually identify the challenges and then how do we go and solve it. I think the money side of it can come. I mean, there's a lot of money out there. That's something I've learned. Sometimes it's just a little bit difficult to channel it through, but certainly, whether you look at the coffers of government or it's within even institutions or within industry, there's a lot of money there. It's not, I think, we get hung up on money, and I don't think money is the right, the be all and end all, but it certainly does help us enable at the end of the day.
So one of the things I talk about quite a lot, and I see it when I go globally, is, each country tries to solve its own problems. And, if you put that in an Australian context, you probably spend 2 to 3% of the global R&D budget in food innovation, but you want 100% of the good ideas. So to me, it's about how you build partnerships that go beyond your borders and looking to find the best ideas from all over the world. And I think, that if you're finding the best ideas, you will get the finance to make those best ideas into reality.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for those insights there. We've got another very specific question, but I think it's an interesting one. It's for Anna. With the new MSA grading for dairy breeds, how can government policy support a more dual-purpose dairy industry and help industry meet consumer expectations by rearing bobby calves for a beef product?
That is a very good question, which I had not thought about before I came here. Industry has rolled out a bunch of marketing programs and that dairy innovation, which is basically about producing beef products from a dairy supply chain, so creating new demand out of old supply chains. You just want government to enable that. And there is a lot of scrutiny and interest in the dairy industry at the moment. And maybe one of the positive things government could do is provide some support in their regional-based marketing and their regional development programs to enable businesses who want to diversify to do just that. The technical specifics of that program I'm totally not across, but government should enable that innovation to as I said, create the new demand from old supply chains. But DJ may have a comment on that.
Yeah, so bobby calves, yes, every industry's got an Achilles heel, and dairy, it is bobby calves. One of the great travesties is who's got responsibility for bobby calves when you do talk about the industries? Is it dairy or is it meat? And even into the degree where we've got to get that sorted within how we fund, how we research, how we take the lead in that one particular issue is a concern for industry ourselves. And coming back to agriculture, every choice we make, there is a compromise. And yes, we can push towards a more dual-purpose animal, but what is it, what we're trying to achieve? Is it animal welfare standard? Is it a best placement of a meat-producing animal, or is it an actual just focus on milk itself? So there's always going to be a compromise within that question. I think that we have to make sure that we're doing best practice animal welfare across the board, but I think there's also a responsibility of both of the meat and dairy industries to make sure that they've got the responsibility or that supply chain worked out coherently between the two industries, because it's the handover between the two isn't smooth.
Okay.
Great, thanks for that. And I'm going to take the last question because I've been dying for this question. But I've worked in government for many years as well, but so I'm thinking, how can government regulators behave somewhat like a business? If we think of business and a taxpayer, having a taxpayer being the revenue stream for a company, how do governments as businesses avoid disruption? And being disrupted means being, I suppose, redundant. How does government avoid being redundant by avoiding disruption?
When I listened to Howard just earlier today, one of the comments he made was the speed of change is faster than our response. And I think we have to accept that's the reality. I think being more nimble, being more responsive, and being more commercial, literally saying, come and have a look at my farm, or come and have a look at my food manufacturing business, understand how it operates. So you're not making or decisions in isolation of the real world. Now, of course, that's quite intensive, but getting that ability to pick up the phone, and I'm from South Australia, we're a small state, everyone knows everybody. You pick up the phone and talk to someone before you make before you continue to have unintended consequences.
2 points I would make about that question. The first one is regulation doesn't need to be 100% right. It's probably better to get something that's 90% of the way there in place and start to iterate it in the same way that people iterate other product solutions. They behave more like a business. And I suppose secondly, from my perspective, making sure that you are thinking like a business in terms of the investment, where you're directing investment, so that it creates that opportunity so that people in the government are incentivised to make better decisions as well.
Probably two things I'll add, if I can, is I guess one is around, what I call sort of test, pivot and learn, that exactly go in the shoes of where it is that you need to understand and have the empathy to come back in. But also, don't try and make everything that 100% piece as well. The other thing is, I think, as we sit in this country and we look at everywhere else around the world, how do we stand on the shoulders of giants? We don't need to invent everything here. We don't need to be able to feel, innovation is actually about how do you create value and where you look at it and how do you quickly go from there, and whether it's in regulation or it's driving policy or investment or new widgets and gadgets and everything else, that'll be one of the ways I think that we can unlock that.
One of my pet frustrations is contract terms. If you're employing somebody for a 3-year term to do a task within a department, that gives them no longevity to create a career, no longevity for them to actually develop the networks that they need to sustain a business approach. If you're in business, you're in it for the long haul. And you also get remunerated if you're doing a great job, and your outcomes should reflect on how you actually get a bonus or benefit from it. So I find it very frustrating when you see in research world or even in department world where things have time frames. Yes, you do need to assess, revalue, and actually make sure that you've got a lifespan of a certain product, a lifespan of a certain agenda. But when you actually tie that to a budget where you know that the last year of whatever you're doing, you're searching to create the next thing to make sure that you've got a lifespan, a career in your position, it really does diverge from what the actual purpose is that you're there in the first place.
Great. Thanks very much for the panel and Angeline for moderating that session. Just wanted to thank our Teenovator, who Ariba, she's probably in the crowd. If not, she's hanging around somewhere. So do say g'day to her. She's got lots of ideas to share and they're so brave. So feel free to step out to grab a coffee. We're starting the next session in about 10 minutes. And it'll be on the next area of our Ag Revolution, focused on AI and big data. So a big round of applause for our panel and Angeline for moderating that session.
Everyone.
Thank you.